Please be seated. Speaking of being seated, you may have noticed that there is a lot of sitting in our scripture readings this morning. Abraham is sitting at the door of his tent in Genesis 18. Mary, of course, sits at Jesus' feet in Luke 10, listening to his teaching. Just to pad my numbers a little bit, I might even try to make a case that the first verse of Psalm 15 has a similar image. O Lord, who shall sojourn? Who shall sit in your tent? Now, of course, we are not particularly big on sitting these days for both practical and philosophical reasons. Now, practically speaking, it is probably true that we sit too much, right? We need to move more than we often do. And to help us, we do things like wearing those wristwatches that count our steps. Okay, hands up. Who has one of those on today? There we go. Okay, we got a few. And some of us, I suspect, may even have or have seen those newfangled standing desks at work that enable us to stay out of our office chairs while we're blankly staring at our computer screens all day. So practically speaking, we aren't big on sitting. We're trying to find ways to help us do it less. And I'd say here in Northern Virginia, most of us don't like just sitting still in other ways as well. What do I mean by that? Well, let's do a little experiment this morning. Before I begin, let me just say I realize this won't work for all of us. Do you have your cell phone on you? Okay, no judgment, but is it on? How many phones are on? Hold it up. Mine's on. It's okay. Get your phone out now. Open it up. Get through your lock screen. Go to your calendar application. Yeah. Let's look at that. How many events do you have coming up in the next week? 10? 20? 30? About 40, like I do? More than that? How much sitting still do you have scheduled in the next week? I'll let you count this Sunday as one, even if it's not on your schedule. And look, I get it. A lot of the things we are doing, a lot of the things on our calendars matter. They're important. In some ways, I understand we may not even feel like we have a choice about them. We have those work meetings and deadlines. Maybe our kids or our grandkids have a swim meet or a birthday party. Maybe 2 or 3 of those things. Maybe even some of those busy things on our schedule are here at church, at Epiphany. But this is what I think we need to see this morning. And to be honest, this is what I think we need to be reminded of again and again in the midst of our busy lives here in Northern Virginia. We do need to sit still. And yes, it is hard to be Marys in the Martha world we live in. But we do sometimes need to be quiet for our own good and for the good of others. We do need to figure out ways and times to disengage from being the best employee and the perfect parent and grandparent and the best volunteer that everyone leans on, even if you're volunteering here at Church of the Epiphany. And here's why. First, friends, while the stuff we do does matter, it matters less than we think it does. And secondly, and this is the most important thing, I think the thing our readings this morning push us towards, it seems to be that it's only when we sit still that we are in a place to really encounter God. Now I know my first point here sounds a bit like blasphemy here in Northern Virginia, but I mean it. The stuff we do, the stuff we fill our calendars with, matters less than we have been told it does. And the main reason it matters less than we have been told it does, is because, and hear me on this, it doesn't actually matter to God. To be blunt, friends, just to give one example, God does not actually care a whole lot about our jobs. Even if we have one of those awesome jobs where we get to help people and change the world every day. Even if you're like me and you have a church job. For that matter, high school and college students here this morning, and parents, don't listen to this, this may give you the chills. God has next to no interest in your GPA, your standardized test score, or how many leadership positions you hold, or how many extracurricular activities you feel compelled to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that your college of choice won't care. But even on that front, it is probably less important than you fear. And you can test me on this. Ask your parents when you get home how many of their high school accomplishments are still on their resume 10 years after college. I will wager my prestigious Alfreda Satry Torgerson Award, and that's really the name of it, for exceptional dedication as a first-time staff member to the work of my college paper, The Concordian, that answer is going to be within 1 or 2 of 0. Now I realize I'm overdrawing things a bit, and I'm being a bit blasphemous here in our Northern Virginia culture that values these things so much. We're in a culture that firmly believes in winning awards and setting goals and keeping busy and doing things that are important. And I also realize I'm begging a question, right? This question. If it is not all the busy stuff that you do, what does God care about? You. God cares about you. Not as his project, not as his worker bee, not as his strategic asset for that big thing he has planned next week. He actually just cares about you. And not only that, but God cares about you before you were useful to him at all, before you had anything to offer him in return. Paul puts it this way in Colossians chapter 1 this morning. He says, and you and me, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death. Why? Why did Jesus reconcile us by his death? So that you can work really hard for him and change the world? No. Look at verse 22 of Colossians chapter 1. In order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach. Friends, hear me in this. Holiness, set apartness for God, is the only life project that matters in the end. And it is equally open to A students and D students, to CEOs and dishwashers, if and only if we are not too busy to pursue it. So first, friends, the stuff that we do, all that stuff, those things you saw on your calendar app when you looked at your phone, it matters less than we have been told it does. Maybe, just maybe, some of our busyness is not as necessary as it seems to be. Maybe, just maybe, we won't be causing the immediate collapse of all that is good and true and beautiful if we just took a break from it now and then. That's not the only reason. That's not the only reason to make time for stillness in our life. Like I said, the second reason is the most important one. There is a strong correlation. There is a strong connection between setting still and encountering God. And we see that in both Genesis and in Luke this morning. You see, in Genesis 18, Abraham isn't doing anything when his visitors show up. He's sitting in the door of his tent in the heat of the day. Probably he's taking that incredibly civilized and wonderful tradition, a siesta, in the middle of the afternoon when it's just too hot to work. He has no busy schedule at this moment to keep him from offering hospitality to these unexpected guests. And guess what? Because Abraham is available like that, because he takes his time and has the time to put unexpected people before other stuff, we hear that he entertains God himself in these three mysterious messengers. Now, I'll be honest. I have never had an angelic visitor, much less three of them, speaking truth into my life for God himself, show up at my office on some Wednesday afternoon. A lot of the time, I have to admit, I'm very busy. Too busy to really stand before you today and suggest that you should follow my example when it comes to making time to be still. I'm working on this, but I'm not there yet. But friends, I will say this. In my own life and among my own busy moments, I have rarely lost out when I have said yes to someone who has stopped by and asked if I have time to talk, even if I don't really feel like I have time to talk. In fact, I would hazard a guess that I have had some of the most meaningful and spiritual conversations in my time here at Epiphany, when my schedule said I should really be doing something else. Think about it for a moment in your own life. How has that worked for you? I'm not saying that every time we prioritize a person over our busyness, it's bound to be a home run. But generally speaking, those conversations are at least as good as that spreadsheet or Word document we're slaving away over, or that endless pile of laundry on the floor. So we see here in Genesis 18 that Abraham was still enough to be ready to welcome God when he showed up. I think if we look at Luke 10 and Mary and Martha, we get an even stronger example of what it looks like to sit still instead of give in to busyness. So let's talk about that for a bit. And the moment here's a simple one, but I'm going to walk us through it. If you'd like to follow along, Luke 10 is page 869 in the blue Bibles in front of you. So this is a simple moment. There's just a few sentences here in Luke chapter 10. And it's about these two sisters, Mary and Martha. And we know from many other places in the gospel that these are longtime friends and supporters of Jesus. And here in Luke 10, they're playing host to Jesus and his disciples, his group of close followers, at their house in their hometown in Bethany. But even though they're sisters, and they're in the same place, and they're closely related, and they have the same love for Jesus, in this little moment, they act in very different ways, don't they? Martha, who Luke says here owns the house, and from that it's pretty likely she's the older sister. Martha is doing her best to make sure that all the social and cultural norms of having guests are being met. And friends, that's a big project. It's clearly a big project. Imagine 20 people coming into your house and you needing to entertain and take care of them. I mean, Martha probably is running around with her hair on fire at this moment, right? Because the standards of hospitality, if anything, are higher than those we have today. We actually get a picture of them if we look at Genesis 18 again. That whole description of how Abraham greets his guests is exactly what Martha would feel was required of her as well. They must be welcomed. Their feet must be washed. They need to be made comfortable. And then a real meal, a meal that's bigger than what has been promised. A feast has to be prepared and presented. And Martha's all alone. No wonder she's distracted with much serving in this moment, trying to meet this requirement. And no wonder it annoys her just a little bit that her younger sister Mary is just sitting around with the men, no less, breaking a taboo in this culture, listening to Jesus. So Martha tries to get some support. Look at verse 40. She says to Jesus, and I can kind of imagine her sidling up to Jesus, as you and I have done when someone's in a public place and we kind of need to tell them something, and says, "Lord, Do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. Notice this. Instead of Jesus doing what Martha hoped for, sending Mary into the kitchen to lend a hand, Jesus gently suggests that Martha has things backwards. It's not Mary that's too lazy, it's Martha that's too busy. Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. But one thing is necessary, says Jesus. Mary's chosen the good portion. It's verses 41 and 42. So friends, don't be too busy. Sit at Jesus' feet and listen to him. And we may hear that and go, well, that sounds nice, but what does that actually mean? What are you asking me to do, Peter? How do we bring Mary and Martha and Abraham, for that matter, into our world as we continue today? Well, friends, this is what I think, and this is going to mostly apply to those of us here at Epiphany. If you go to another church regularly, think about this in the context of your church. Here at Epiphany, we have somewhere over 120 people in our congregation that take some significant volunteer role. I've counted them. It's really true, honest. And that's great. We're a small church, but because we have so many volunteers who give so much, we get a lot done. We punch above our weight, we might say. This is what I worry about sometimes. Are you so busy getting good things done? So busy making sure that there's a cake for coffee hour, and that the video feed is broadcasting, and the offering is counted, and that there's food in those bags we send over to Coates every month, that you're not taking time to sit at Jesus' feet and learn from him. Well, what about it? If you are heavily involved here at Epiphany, and I know that's many of us, are you still able to make time to sit at Jesus' feet? If you're heavily involved in a ministry somewhere else, if you're in Christian leadership, do you still have time to sit at Jesus' feet? Can you come here on Sunday just to worship sometimes? Can you serve in your ministry sometimes? Not like Martha, who's anxious and troubled by many things, but like Mary. Friends, I have said this before. Let me say it again in this context. There are no life sentences to particular ministries or volunteer activities here at Epiphany. I suspect there are a few folks in here that may want to challenge me on that, but honestly, there are no life sentences. It is appropriate, and as Genesis 18 and Luke 10 shows us, even spiritual, at times just to sit down and wait to encounter God. And friends, that's what we're about as a church. At the end of the day, all these things we do, even those things we do to keep the lights on around here, as much as I love them and I appreciate what you give, are nothing if this is not a place where you have the space and can have the stillness you need to encounter God. And sometimes we have to make it that place because we live in this culture that asks so much of us and puts such a heavy burden on us for success, when really that's not the thing God is most interested in at all. He is interested in you. He loves you as you are. He invites you to sit in his presence and encounter him. Friends, if you are too busy to do that in your life or even here at your church, you are too busy. Amen.